and welcome. Wonderful to see you tonight on this non-raining evening. I'm Sheila Barrett, Deputy Director of the University of Oxford North American Office. And while you don't want to hear much from me, I'm going to speak for a little bit. We have been supporting the university's many programs in North America, including acting as a central point for the colleges, hosting both virtual and in-person events, working with alumni groups, and collaborating with Oxford's amazing faculty and students on major initiatives for about 3 decades. It is wonderful you are here to hear Professor Amy Dickman give her talk, Wildlife, Warriors, and Women, WildCRU's work in Africa and beyond. A little bit about WildCRU, which is the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit. It was the first university-based conservation research unit in Europe. It is part of Oxford's Department of Zoology, which is now formally the Department of Biology. WildCRU is a pioneering interdisciplinary research unit that uses the best science to underpin conservation solutions with an approach that is interdisciplinary and collaborative. Their approach has proven over and over again to be tremendously effective and involves research to understand and address a problem, education to explain the problem, active community involvement to ensure participation and acceptance, and fourth, implementation of long-term solutions. WildCRU has over 80 researchers and has grown to be one of the largest and most productive conservation research units in the world, with members who span over 30 countries. At the forefront of it all is Professor Amy Dickman, Kaplan Fellow in Wildcat Conservation. Amy is a conservation biologist who has worked in Africa for over 2 decades. She specializes in human-carnivore conflict and community-based conservation. She is a member of IUCN's Cat Specialist Group, the IUCN Human-Wildlife Conflict Specialist Group, and the African Lion Working Group. She has published over 100 papers and book chapters on large carnivore conservation. She is co-founder of the Pride Lion Conservation Alliance and is helping to develop initiatives to empower future female conservation leaders in Africa. She is an award-winning conservationist and a National Geographic explorer. We are delighted to have Amy here as the newly appointed director of WildCRU. With that, it is our great pleasure to hand the floor over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and thank you everyone for turning up tonight. It's really lovely to be here. I'm going to be talking about our work primarily in Tanzania, but also talking about that wider work of WildCRU that we do across the globe. So why focus on wildlife? Wildlife has always been central to human culture. For as long as people have existed, wildlife has been intertwined with their lives. For example, this picture on the left here is the Lowenmensch. This is the first figurative art carved by people, thought to be about 40,000 years ago, carved out of woolly mammoth ivory. And in that very first depiction of people, it is a lion head on a human body. So from the very beginning, they were really sort of central to the culture. Similarly, on the right, you can see cave paintings from the south of France. These were drawn about 30,000 years ago and depict lions in tableaus that you would see if you went to the Serengeti today. And it's not surprising that wildlife and biodiversity has always been so central to humanity because it underpins everything that it means to be humans and everything that supports us as humans. But unfortunately, despite that centrality of nature to us, we are really at a cliff edge right now for biodiversity. I won't depress you too much, but biodiversity is in severe decline worldwide. This is a map looking at biodiversity declines by region of the world, and you can see those red areas are severely depleted in terms of biodiversity. Vertebrate populations have dropped by about 68% on average since the 1970s. And that's to do with a plethora of things, but mainly to do with the conversion of natural habitat towards anthropogenic habitats and things like unsustainable use, bushmeat poaching, etc. Now, WildCRU, as Sheila touched on, has been addressing these threats since 1986 and was a pioneering body in actually seeing forward and saying, how do we, rather than just do good science for the sake of science, how do we do good conservation science and turn that into great conservation action? And it was set up by David MacDonald in 1986. He has long been an inspiration to me. And as Sheila said, it's part of the Department of Biology now at Oxford. And its mission is simple. The mission has stayed the same all the way through for the past 35 years, to achieve practical solutions to conservation problems through original scientific research. Now, I, in 1986, had far smaller visions. And to be fair, I was a child. But ever since being a child, I've been passionate about big cats for no particular reason. I grew up in Devon. The biggest thing we had was a slightly aggressive moggy. So it came from nowhere, but every time we had a family day out, I would drag our family to the zoo to stare at lions. Everyone was bored, but whatever. And in 1986, actually, by happenstance, I buried a memory box with my brother at the time. I was 10, and in it we had what we wanted to be doing at the then unimaginable age of 30. And I only had two things written on mine. We dug it up many years later and we looked at it, and it said that I wanted to be in the Serengeti studying lions, and I wanted to have a zebra-striped Land Rover. And I have to say, I actually spent my 30th birthday in the Serengeti watching lions. And I thought back to that 10-year-old and I thought, God, how funny that that actually turned out. I still haven't got the zebra-striped Land Rover. I have many Land Rovers in the field that are all broken. I need to paint one. But ultimately, when those things developed over time, and I thought, how do I get into big cat research? WildCRU was something that has inspired me all the way through from when I first learned about it, because it does such fantastic work. And I was mainly inspired by it because it seemed that if you join WildCRU, you're just given a big cat study. So here's David and Andy with a lion, David with a cheetah, Arjun with a tiger, Andy Hearn with a clouded leopard. So I was super excited and desperate to join this group. I was fortunate enough to get an undergraduate scholarship to go, just after I'd finished my undergraduate, to go and have this sort of internship with WildCRU. And I was absolutely beyond thrilled to go and meet David MacDonald, this hero of mine, and to find out which big cat I would be studying, to put me on this path of greatness. And he said, Amy, he said, wonderful to have you here. You're going to be studying the water shrew. And I was like, And I thought, you know, this is big for a shrew. It's the biggest of the shrews in the UK, but it's about 15,000 times smaller than a lion. So I was like, okay, I get it. Everyone has to start small. You know, the big cats are just around the corner. So I worked on water shrews. I say worked. I never saw one of them. I don't believe they exist in the UK. But things got bigger eventually with the water vole. And David said to me, I really think you'll be well suited to have a PhD in water voles. And I'm like, I don't want to work on water voles. They're not lions. And eventually I was stubborn and he pushed me to, and I finally got to work on a carnivore, something with proper big teeth. So this was getting better, but not great. And so eventually I got fed up and I had an offer at Cambridge to go and join their meerkat project. And fair enough, meerkats aren't actually cats, but you know, it's right there in the name. And I figured, no offense, but to a lot of Americans, I could probably get away with it. So, but you know what it's like at Oxford. You can't leave to Cambridge. It really annoys people. So David said, no, don't go. He said, we've got a woman starting who is going to be doing her PhD in Namibia on cheetahs. Would you like to work on cheetahs? And I was like, yes, I would. So I went out to work with Laurie Marker on cheetahs. I went out for 6 months originally and stayed there for 6 years and learned an incredible amount from Laurie, particularly about the importance of understanding and addressing human-wildlife conflict and what a threat it was to these cats. But I still had a hankering for lions, and eventually I ended up doing my master's, my PhD, and eventually got a fellowship at Oxford with Pembroke College on human-wildlife conflict and setting up a research project that was dealing with addressing conflict, particularly focused on lions. And lions are one of the most iconic species, as we saw from those statues. Lions have inspired people for as long as we've existed, but most people don't realise how extreme the decline is of lions. Since the first Lion King film, which many of us will remember, and I thought was amazing, apart from how they depicted hyenas, which is horrible, and the second one that came out, lion numbers have halved. So these animals are more threatened than rhinos, than gorillas, than elephants, but people don't think of that. So there's a huge decline in these species. And this is just to give you a depiction of that. So this is the historic range of lions in 1890. This is an estimate, maybe 200,000 lions. By 1970, it dropped significantly, but still fairly well connected. And by 2020, that range had contracted extensively. And actually now we think there are probably only 6 populations of lions that have at least 1,000 lions left. Most of these populations have fewer than 100 lions and are unlikely to persist long term. So there's a huge urgency for action. The main things driving those declines are human-wildlife conflict, the loss of wild prey, and the loss of that natural habitat. So Lion Landscapes is one of the many WildCRU projects, and I run it jointly with Elaine Cotterill, who also got her PhD. She got her PhD through Oxford. And we work in some of the remaining lion strongholds. So we work in Ruaha in southern Tanzania, in Saluniere in southern Tanzania, thought to have the biggest lion population left on the planet, in Laikipia, very important for Kenya, and in the Luangwa Valley, which is a stronghold for connectivity between important populations. And what we do at Lion Landscapes, we have a very classic WildCRU approach where we have very integrated science. It is about the science, of course, because we're an evidence-based unit, but that science has to be delivering conservation action. It has to be focused particularly on including the relevant stakeholders and local communities in that conservation science. And we have a real focus on communities because another thing we're very bad at communicating is that a lot of wildlife relies heavily on human-dominated land. And when people see them, you know, the David Attenborough documentaries, you don't get that sense. You see lions in amazing places away from people. But the reality is that particularly around core protected areas, lions and other wildlife heavily rely on these human-dominated landscapes. And in those lands, people tend to be very, very vulnerable. Most of the people in the sites that we work live on less than $1 a day. They have very poor access to education, healthcare, nutrition, sanitation, clean water. They're extremely vulnerable already. And then they're living cheek by jowl with some of the most important big cat populations left on the planet. That leads to major economic and cultural costs because a lot of these people are heavily dependent socially on livestock as well as it being their main economic asset. And this leads to huge amounts of killing. So these are some pictures from the very beginning of our field work around Ruaha in southern Tanzania, when we knew from the scientific work that we'd done that people said they had this high level of conflict with big cats, they didn't like them, but they also said, well, we didn't kill them. And I thought, I don't believe you. If I was you, I would be killing those cats. So we ended up setting up a tiny field camp there, living in tents, living amongst those communities and finding out how much killing was really going on. And the killing was sky high. This is the highest recorded rate of lion killing anywhere in East Africa. And 2 things to note. One is that many of the lions that we were finding were missing a right front paw, and that was often the only body part that was missing. And the second one was a lot of the animals, particularly the poisoned ones, were heavily pregnant females with cubs ready to be born. There is no better way of driving a population down, potentially to local extinction, than taking out the reproductively active females. So we knew this was a major issue. And when we talked to people, they said the people you have to talk to are the Barabaig. The Barabaig are the tribe doing a lot of the killing. Now, most people have never heard of the Barabaig. They're a sister tribe to the Maasai. But they wear black instead of red. They're also highly secretive and highly hostile. So they do not engage with outsiders. And everyone said to us, you'll never be able to work with the Barabaig. They just won't talk to anyone, let alone conservationists. And sure enough, we lived in that field camp for 2 years, inland, right alongside the Barabaig, and they never talked to us. We would go up and try and approach their houses, and they would run away. Regularly, we were really just scared by trying to interact with them, and they didn't do anything. They just wouldn't interact. We tried all the classic kind of community meetings, etc. Then we put up solar panels at our camp 2 years in. I was really giving up hope by then. I thought we're just not going to be able to work with them at all. We put up solar panels at camp to charge our laptops. Then the Barabaig turned up to charge their mobile phones. And to this day, it kills me that I didn't think of this. It is the last thing that any one of us would give up in the bush is our mobile phones. And it's the same for the Barabaig. They use them for tracking livestock prices, for reporting if kids have gone missing in the bush, reporting if livestock have gone missing, or just sending funny things on WhatsApp, the same as everyone else does. So this wasn't a breakthrough immediately, but it did mean we were useful to them for the first time ever, because before they had to walk about 20 kilometers to charge their phones. So then here they could actually have a charging station. They would wait for their phones to be charged, and it enabled them just to start to kind of be there and look at what we did. And eventually that led to a meeting with the warriors after a terrifying incident where they almost speared us to death, but that's a different story. But eventually they decided to meet with us. And this was brilliant. Finally, 2 and a bit years in, we met with them and we said, we are not the police. We are not the wildlife division. We are not trying to get you in trouble. All we're trying to do is understand why you kill quite this many lions and what you get from it. And if there's a way of getting that without causing such a conservation issue. And so they were thrilled. They said they'd work with us. And we literally, I remember walking away from that meeting thinking, finally, we've got traction. We're going to work with the Barabeg. Within about 5 days, that same group of warriors went out and killed 7 lions right around our camp. And this was the lowest point of the project by far. Our guys were in tears. And I just thought, we are done. We've tried everything to engage with the communities. And I called a friend of mine, Leela Huzar, who's in the Pride Alliance we talked about. And I said, I just can't deal with this anymore. I've tried everything. And she said, this is a test. She said, they know you care about lions and you've told them you care about the community. So they're putting the two against each other and saying, who do you pick? Your sort of relationship with the lions or your relationship with the community? She said, you've got to do nothing. And it was the best advice. It really spoke to having people you can turn to in those situations. And we did nothing. We measured the carcasses and everything. And about a week later, they called us and they invited us down to their traditional meeting. They'd never invited outsiders down, let alone a Westerner. And we had this great meeting and said, if you want to understand about conflict, fine, we'll talk to you about why we kill lions. And there were 4 key elements to why they killed lions. The first and the obvious one that most projects deal with is that attacks on livestock. And these are major costs. These impose costs of about 18% of the annual cash income on people. None of us would put up with that kind of loss. And often it was somebody's entire livelihood being wiped out in a single night. The second, and this is really important as well, is that people got few or no benefits associated with wildlife. And those benefits that did occur were very unevenly distributed. It used to go to one village, usually a more sort of developed village where they didn't actually have more impacts from the wildlife. So the people suffering the costs were not the people getting the benefits. The third, and this was so important that we finally managed to break through with the Barabeg warriors, was about money and status. So they explained to us that a lot of the lion killing is about going and proving that you are brave and you're a true sort of warrior. And they said when they go out and they spear a lion, the first guy that throws the spear and hits it, even if they don't kill the lion, is the one that gets to cut off the paw. They take the claw and they put it on an amulet on their arm and they go around the communities and they get gifts of cattle from the rest of the community. And that cattle are the currency. So this is a way of young men getting wealthy and a way of young men getting the attention of women, because women will sleep with them, women will dance with them. It's the same stuff that drives human behavior the world over, money and sex, and it was the same here. So really important to understand those kinds of drivers. And the fourth was just a real lack of conservation awareness. It's like going into, I don't know, Times Square or somewhere. This is going to go badly trying to use an American example. I usually use a UK one, but going in and saying, right, pigeons are endangered, but because it seems impossible, but because these people live with lions all the time. And so it's really important to recognize that we're coming from very different sort of standpoints on this. So we knew a lot more about what the drivers were and we wrote up papers on this and everything. But so we had to start doing something about it. And the first and the easiest place to start was reducing attacks. 2/3 of attacks happened in poorly constructed livestock enclosures. And this is a leopard attack, a leopard coming. I could jump over that, let alone a leopard. So we started reinforcing livestock enclosures with this diamond mesh wire. This was meant to be the start of a multi-step process because frankly, that looks rubbish. If you went to a zoo and that was their lion enclosure, you would leave and report them. But actually, our data shows these are 95% effective at reducing attacks. So really important. The villagers pay some towards it, so it's not just entirely, they have to have some ownership of it. But what you don't want to do is just protect livestock overnight and then have them released in the morning to slightly hungrier carnivores. So we ended up bringing in livestock guarding dogs to protect grazing livestock. And these look cute, but when you give them to a livestock keeper, they're like, have you seen a lion? This looks like a canapé. And so they look ridiculous, but actually they grow into big, impressive dogs and actually a little bit too big because a lot of these families are very food insecure. They have a lot of poverty. Feeding a dog like that is a real challenge. So we're now looking at mixed breed dogs to see how effective those are. We also do something called collaring for coexistence, and this is one where we collar the lions to understand where they're going and where the hot spots of conflict are so that we can target the mitigation approaches in those spots. And we have this on an app that anyone can see. So when we collar the lions, all the people, all the livestock keepers can see the lions in real time on the app. And everyone said, this is crazy. You know, you are telling people where the lions are. They're going to go and kill them. But actually, we thought, I'm sure they won't if they feel more empowered. And the killing has gone down a lot since people feel empowered. And also since they feel trusted as real partners in this, that we weren't scared of sharing information, that we respected their right to sort of manage the livestock as they saw. And this was a really important part of building up trust as well. And so it shows you where the lions go when they move the protected area across the protected areas and where we need to target those efforts. We also have something called coexistence co-op. So in those hotspots of conflict in particular, which techniques work? It can be high-tech stuff like geofence modules that tell you when a big cat moves into your area and how you respond, or something as simple as different ways of reinforcing livestock enclosures. And these have to be mutually exchanged. This is not about, I hate it when you see people saying, we have to educate the community. These communities live with the lions, they've lived with them for forever. So it's learning on both sides about how to adapt things most successfully. So we know we can reduce attacks, but that's the simplest part of it. How do we produce benefits? And we had extensive meetings with the community to find out which benefits matter to them. And the themes that came up are the same that any one of us would pick in those environments: healthcare, education, veterinary medicine, because they rely heavily on livestock. So we invested in all three of those approaches. For instance, with schools, with education, we've twinned schools in the US and the UK and internationally with local schools, and they provide some funds each year, and they provide basic equipment that schools don't have. The schools have no, literally no books, no chairs. It's ridiculous. So this is a really important start of it. But it was very obvious, actually, that secondary school was where the barrier was, because primary school is free, but secondary school is not. And so we started doing fully paid scholarships all the way through secondary school. They cost about $2,000. This is the only time we went against the community, because the community said, we don't want those scholarships to go to girls. Girls will get married, they'll get pregnant, waste of education. And we said, all the data shows that if you invest in girls, it has lifelong benefits. Even for her children, we're going to invest in the girls. Half go to the girls. And it's just amazing to watch those girls go through. We've now supported them through college to come back to be, healthcare assistants, to get that kind of training. It really changes the mind of what it is to be sort of a girl in that community. We found that the children weren't able to actually pass the scholarship exams, even though we'd equipped the primary schools. We said, what else is holding them back? And they said a lack of food, because children are moving in the mornings from their home. They don't have food. They go to school. They don't have food. There's no kitchens. And so children are hungry all day. They just can't focus. So we started a porridge project, very basic stuff. We buy it from the local women, maize, beans, eggs, etc., sugar. This feeds over 1,000 children every day. It is transformative. This is probably the biggest community benefit that we do that is the most valued, because it encourages people to send their kids to school because they get a meal, and it really changes the attainment of the children at school. We also focus on healthcare with a real focus on maternal and neonatal health, because this was really important, particularly for the women. Many people were dying in childbirth, and the children are dying as well, if you have poor care at that time. And providing veterinary benefits. This is all done in partnership with the local sort of authorities to try and make sure that the access to these things was simpler. But these things were going on for several years, and everything was great. People would wave at us, and we felt pretty happy about ourselves. Aren't we doing a great job? And people were still killing the wildlife. And it makes sense. Take the benefits and still kill the wildlife, because the benefits were tied to the project, not the wildlife. At the same time, we were doing camera trapping for our ecological work, and the camera traps were getting stolen because the people weren't engaged in them. And so we thought, this is all going horribly wrong. So how on earth can we bring these together? So we started something called community camera trapping. And this is where we don't do the camera trapping, but the villagers do. So they get employed and trained to do the camera trapping. They decide where they go. We pay the salaries of the people involved. And then we have a system where it's the presence of the wildlife that generates the benefits. And this is done on a points-based system. It took ages to develop with communities, because we had a big fight about how many points each animal should get. I wanted a simple system of 1 to 5 points. They wanted thousands of points. I was like, I don't care, fine. So a Dick will get you 1,000 points now on a camera trap. Something like a baboon or a primate will get you 1,500 points. It's per individual, so the lion will get you 15,000 points. The top spot is an African wild dog at 20,000 points, because we give them more points if they're more endangered or cause more conflict. and it's per individual animal. So this photo got the village 340,000 points for 17 wild dogs. This is a great example of where it really changes the mindset, because that waterhole used to be a real hotspot for snaring and for poisoning. It's the only waterhole for miles around. Once they realised the dens were there and the animals were coming down, the camera traps were protected and the waterhole was legally protected as well. So really encourage it, make sure the community takes the ownership of that. We've adapted over time, so we give 0 points for snared animals to try to discourage snaring. And we also give extra points for highly traded species like pangolins. Most points generate extra healthcare, community and education benefits. That's on top of the other stuff that's happening. And it really does increase tolerance for wildlife on village land. So, for instance, this breeding group of lions is in one of the villages. Camera traps are there, people know they're there, and they're really keen to see those lions stay around. This pangolin was trapped and was going to be sold, and the village said, we want the pangolin there because this pangolin benefits us. They released it back onto village land. Women are absolutely central to this, and we've really intentionally focused a lot on what the women want as benefits, and that's where the healthcare and the education particularly benefit the women. We had one event where the young men in the village went out on a lion hunt, and the women called them back in, nothing to do with us, and we could never have done that. So the women called them back in and they said, you are killing the very thing that is enabling us to give birth safely and educate our children, and we're not having it. And so they put a ban on lion and elephant hunting in that village. And the young men went crazy and said, we want to hunt the lions. And they said, no, our house, our rules. If you live here, you don't get to hunt them. And there was a huge schism, and eventually 3 of these warriors were sort of banished for a time. Eventually they came back. But to watch the community take that ownership was just really amazing. Thinking about the warriors, though, they've got to have something from this. So how do we address the cultural status? And so we employ them in a warrior engagement program. We can give them money every month because we talk to them a lot about what it means to be a warrior. And what it means to be a warrior is to protect your community, to be the go-to people, to have the status. So we employ 17 warriors at the moment every month, and they track lions, they chase lions away if they're near people's houses, they help find lost children and lost livestock to reduce attacks. So we can do that. We said, how on earth can you replace the status? Nothing in my mind could replace actually that bravery of killing a lion. And they said, the only thing that could replace that is learning to read and write, because no one can do that. So it was really, really central. So now we've taught them all to read and write. They're all literate and numerate. And a group of women came to us, a group of mothers, and they said, we used to want our children, our daughters, to marry lion killers, but now we want them to marry lion defenders, because these are the guys that have the passports and know how to use the technology. And it is another sort of change in the program. For improving awareness, super simple, we take people into the park. All these people live by protected areas and don't go in because they don't have cars, they don't have money. And so we take them in, and the number one thing we hear back when people see, say, lions with their cubs, they say, I didn't know lions could be gentle. There's just a real shift because they've only seen them in places where it's probably quite antagonistic. We also showed DVD nights, so films of wildlife, the sort of stuff that any one of us might enjoy. And people come from miles around to see films. We have a generator, we have a sheet up. It's pretty basic, but people come literally from neighbouring villages to see, probably because they want to see the latest Star Wars or something, but whatever, we show them wildlife films and they seem pretty keen. And while this really engages people, the films are in English. And so it frustrates me like crazy. I've spoken to National Geographic and Disney and all those ones who support the programme and said, you show these incredible films called, The Last of the Lions, etc. But these people are the ones that decide if these are going to be the last of the lions. And if that film is in English, the very clear subliminal message, even if someone translates it, is this is not your story. This is not for you. You're an outsider in this. It's so damaging. So I've ranted about people translating these films into proper local languages to absolutely zero goal most of the time. So eventually we did a far smaller effort ourselves. We decided it's really important to make people feel at the heart of their conservation stories. So we wrote a storybook. There's now 3 of them, actually. This is one about the Barabeg living with lions. I brought oh shit, sorry. Excuse the profanity, that was a beep. We brought a couple of them along. So if anyone wants, we've got 5 or 6, anyone has young kids. This is in Swahili and English. And this is the first time the Barabeg have seen themselves in a storybook. And it seems such a tiny thing, but for them to kind of see themselves, and this is them at the heart of it, is really transformative. But this is the second one, Hiker the Hyena Friend. This is a Maasai girl about hyena and vulture coexistence. And we really focused also on how do we build conservation leadership going forwards. And this is everything from our local teams to the wider work through WildCRU about how do you actually empower community leaders at even a global scale. We also have to shift the ideas of conservation. It shouldn't be about poverty alleviation and trying to make things just a little bit better. This should be about wealth creation. These people should be getting wealthy from having the biodiversity that we all value so much on an international level. So we've developed things like Lion Carbon, which is a premium carbon offsetting, and we're now in really active discussions about biodiversity credits and how you make those tradable and internationally verifiable. And this is, I think this is going to be a major stream of conservation funding, hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years. We know this stuff can work. The attacks in the core areas have decreased by over 60%, and the lion killing, which is important to us, has declined by over 70%. Now, that's really important for us, but always the best part about it is seeing the impact it can have on local people. And so we had a girl who entered into our Simba Scholarships program, and she was just her and her mother alone. So her mother had just a single parent family, and in that position, women in particular are really vulnerable. They only had 3 cattle. The child was really promising, so we took her into the scholarship program, and then very soon afterwards, a disease came through their cattle, and all of the cattle died. And there's a real stigma and a lack of status with that, and women are at real risk of being killed as witches if all of their cattle die. So we knew this woman was in real danger, and then we talked to a donor. We managed to get more cattle, so we got 6 cattle in the end, and the child stayed on in school and did well. But then a year later, when she was 14, she was raped and she got pregnant. You're not allowed to stay in school if you're pregnant. So we ended up working with the school's communities and getting her into a different school. And it's one of those things that you have to be really embedded in the community. This isn't just about conservation. This is being really there as part of a partner in those communities. And similarly, we've got a woman called Grace, who we supported all the way through her Simba scholarship into college. She's now back. She's one of the research assistants on the project, and she can talk about this stuff far better than I can, because she's been through it all. And other WildCRU projects, this is just one example of it. Other WildCRU projects have their own stories of equally long engagement with people and how they blend science and action. So things like the Trans-Kalahari Predator Programme, some of you may have heard from Andy earlier in the year, and the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Programme. So as Sheila talked about, we now have over 80 researchers across the world creating positive change for people and for wildlife. Some of these really long-term projects, some are shorter ones that are focused on a specific research question, and a huge diversity of species. And that scientific output, a lot of this is very applied, but of course, we're part of a university unit. We collect all the data, we write up the papers, we contribute to policy, and that scientific output, all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers that come out from WildCRU really do influence policy and management. So things like contributing to the African Wild Dog Action Plans, other species action plans, data from WildCRU led to a moratorium on trophy hunting in Wangi for a period of time. We've got work going on with clouded leopards about looking at the impact of different road initiatives. Ethiopian Wolf Project is a look a lot about disease ecology and vaccinations of wild carnivores, and even things like hedgehog crash test dummies to look at the impact of robotic lawnmowers on hedgehogs in the UK. And just a small example, this was a very recent. Kenya just recently cancelled a tenure for this very expensive road that was going to go through the Aberdares ecosystem. That was a direct result of data that came from one of our students' PhD projects. So, but we have to do more. We know we can have impacts, but how do we scale up? So already we've trained over 175 doctorate and master's graduates from over 40 different countries. And really importantly, we've trained over 110 students from 45 different countries through this postgraduate diploma in wildlife conservation practice. And this is about early career students and getting them equipped to do the training. There's a real focus then on particularly the sort of the global south. And we do a lot of work with additional interns and external training. Wherever there's an opportunity for us to train and to partner with people, then we do so. And thinking of partnerships, that's absolutely at the core of what we do. We are highly collaborative. We really want to make sure that when we do things, it is synergistic with other groups. There are many partners that WildCRU works with, but one example that's very tangible to what I do is Panthera. And I know we've got a couple of their people here today, but a really great example of an organisation that works across the world on wildcat conservation. So if we can work together to help underpin some of that science, learn from the conservation action and feed it back, and collect that data and make it kind of a combined process, then we can bring those different strengths of different organisations together. Things like the Arabian leopard are a really good example of where we're working closely together. But there is an urgent need to do more. Biodiversity is still under severe decline, and it will take us all if we're going to have this better dawn for wildlife. So while people, if they think about Oxford, they tend to think about, the the ivory towers and the gleaming spires and everything. And this can seem so remote from it, but we need that really committed group of scientists. We need the best science to underpin good conservation. And we need the wider community, the people like you, your contacts, etc., to make sure for species that are so globally valued, for wildlife that is so important to us as a global community, it will take a global community to make sure that we can actually build a better future, both for wildlife and for people as well. So thank you very much.
Having virtual events here around the class. So we have time for one or two questions. We want to make sure we have time to enjoy each other's conversation through the coverage. But if I could take one or two hands for questions for you, that'd be lovely. If you have a question, or you can also save them for the Go ahead.
You mentioned that you're almost speared by a warrior. Is that that's maybe the fun one, but then I read in The Economist that I think it's a vanity project. They're trying to reintroduce cheetahs to India. Do you feel the future of conservation is introducing big cats into areas where there's very few big cats, or is it more consolidating around communities in Tanzania that have more sustainable populations?
Okay, so in terms of the warrior spearing, yes, this was like 2 and a bit years in where they just refused to talk to us. It was ridiculous. And finally, it was about 11 o'clock at night, and myself and 2 of the Tanzanians were sitting at our field camp, and we heard what was clearly a celebration of a lion hunt going on. And it was, people were singing and banging the spears and making lion roar sounds, and we were like, that's it, we're just going to go and talk to them. So we stormed off through the bush on foot, and it was a really cloudy night. It was a moonlit night, but very cloudy, so it was super dark. And about halfway up through the bush towards this household, suddenly all 3 of us stopped, and we all got that sort of prickling feeling on the back of your neck. And I thought, I don't know what it is. Is it a lion? Is it a leopard? What's going on? And then the clouds parted a bit, and the moonlight came down, and we were entirely surrounded by a group of warriors with their spears up. And then it went dark again, and I was like, oh my God, we're going to die. And we were saying, like research, just doing research. And these guys, Shabani, who we now work with very closely, he stepped forward and he said, what are you doing? He said, it turned out, unbeknownst to us, there'd been a lot of cattle rustling between the Maasai and the Barabeg, stealing each other's cattle, and they will murder each other with impunity. There was a lot of murder that had been going on. And they said, we almost speared you. And they can, watching them throw spears, you don't want to be on the end of it. And so they said, we almost speared you. But then we listened, and we thought no Maasai would make that much noise coming through the bush. And so they didn't kill us because we are apparently very clod-footed going through the bush. And then they said, if you're this desperate, we'll talk to you. And then actually that led to that warrior meeting. So that was the warrior thing. And then the second one about the reintroduction, I think it's much, much better to focus on existing populations because there's many problems with reintroductions. They can work. There have been examples of good reintroductions, but the problem is you're dealing with an area where people have often lost the tolerance for them. There's a reason why big cats aren't there anymore. And creating a landscape that has sufficient space and prey and human tolerance without relocating people and having all those ethical dilemmas becomes very hard. So much better and more cost efficient to focus on existing populations. It doesn't mean it can't always be done, but yeah, we'll focus on that. Yeah.
You showed us a slide showed the disastrous decline. Other than humans killing, so you spent most of your presentation on them. Were there other causes for this catastrophic?
Definitely. The major cost for big cats and for other biodiversity is just land conversion, because wildlife is not a viable land use for most people in most places. So, it's much better to actually dig up that land and convert it into maize fields or whatever, or general agriculture, than it is to leave it as natural habitat. So the conversion of habitat is by far the primary threat. And in terms of sort of what we can do about that, things like those new revenue streams for biodiversity, where you actually properly incentivize with significant amounts of money the countries and the communities that are living alongside that intact habitat and those intact ecosystems and making that a resource, that it should be far more valuable than a maize field. And yet at the moment it's not, because we have a real market failure where we have an international value associated with it, but locally no value or negative value. So we've got to square that circle somehow. And do let me know if anyone wants a book for their young children or grown-up children. You know, you can pretend to be a kid. There's wine.